Can you hear me?
Yep, come through loud and clear. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Dean, I have 10:30 on the dot. Seeing the participant numbers still going up.
How many do we have?
We've got 432 on the line.
They're getting on, slowly but surely.
Right.
Chief, are you
Give it a few minutes.
yet?
I've found the chief. I'm elevating chief to audio panelists right now to activate audio. So, chief, if you're on the line, you just need to click the audio button in the lower left of the WebEx screen, and then you'll be able to select whether you want to connect through your computer or have it call you. I see the audio now pop up, and you probably would just need to unmute yourself in the WebEx screen there. I've now unmuted. Chief, your audio is now active.
I'm on the conference call, guys. I'll be right back with you. Don't wait on me to get started, please.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Chief.
So being we're about 462 attendees right now.
We're getting there.
10:32. Folks, if you're just joining, you are joining as listen only. So stand by for instructions on how to contribute to the conversation.
Hey, good morning, Sabine. Are you guys ready to get started?
I believe we are. Doug, are you ready?
Yep, ready to go. We can advance and get started.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. This is Sabine Gam. I'm with the exercise unit of the Texas Division of Emergency Management. I'd like to welcome you to our Hurricane Locura virtual response exercise, or workshop. And we have, I'm very honored to have our chief with us, who is gonna say a few words to get us started and point us in the right direction. So, Chief, if you can take this over.
Good morning, Sabine. Thank you, and thanks to the over 500 folks that are on the line. I know it's a busy time for a lot of us with the COVID response that's happening. I know the COVID response is going to create a few new challenges for us in the way that we respond to and recover from hurricanes, but I know the team that you have on the ground, our local first responders and elected officials, will be at the tip of the spear leading all the time. Sabine, thanks to you and your team for putting all this together. I know it's important that we continue to do this even while our focus is on COVID-19. Our eyes have to stay on the Gulf as well. So thanks for all you do, and I'll stick around here as long as I can and keep up the great work.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Chief. And we know that you're working on our behalf as well, so we do appreciate that very much. For everybody else who is joining, just to reiterate, you are on mute automatically, and to please use the chat function of the WebEx to kind of, put your questions in, anything that you need. And our facilitator, Doug Flood, is going to give you specific instructions for that. So, Doug, if I can have my next slide, please.
Sure.
Great. This is an exercise, so we want to make sure that we kind of follow a good path. Our goal is really to assist our partner agencies, be it at the local, state, or federal level even, and their planners to really prepare for the hurricane season. And, of course, not just the regular hurricane season as normal, but under pandemic conditions. So our goals really for the workshop are very, very clear, very straightforward. We want to make sure that we have adequate transportation, that we can facilitate those needs from our local jurisdictions. We also want to discuss the healthcare and sanitation issues that come up with an evacuation and sheltering, and of course the mass care that is associated with evacuation and sheltering. Those are our main objectives for this workshop, and we have a tremendous turnout. While not everybody is signed in yet, we have close to 900 participants in this exercise from local, state, federal level. We also have a tribal community with us. So we really, really appreciate that. One piece of guidance that I want to give is definitely when you're putting in, we got questions here already. I'm going to get those to those in just a second. When you want to post a question or questions in the chat room, please put in the front who you're addressing it to. We want to make sure that if you have something for dishes, for public health folks, put dishes on there, and then would post your questions, or Texas Military Department, then post your question. And if there's anything additionally, please send me an email. Everyone online has my email. And if there's any questions that are not addressed, you can send those to me as well, and we recirculate them and then have the larger discussion later on. So thank you very much to all of our presenters. We really appreciate you. You've been working long hours, and you still took the time and put this together. So thank you very, very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who is going to keep us straight throughout this workshop. Our net support team from the National Exercise Division has been phenomenal, and I'm going to hand this back to you now. Thank you, Doug.
Great. Thanks, Sabina. Before we get into the presentations today, folks, I wanted to just cover a couple things about the WebEx and how we'll structure the workshop so that we can make sure we gather all the great input, have a great discussion, and get everyone oriented to the workshop interface here. So as you may have heard me mention before and heard Sabina mention, there could be close to 900 folks joining right now. I see about 560. So due to that high number of individuals on this, we've reduced the speaking privileges to only the presenters. So most of you will be in listen-only mode. And what we'd ask you to do, if you've called in separately just on audio, make sure your phone is on mute. We haven't heard any background noise from anybody. That's great. Really appreciate that. So what we'd like to do, if you have a question or a discussion point that you'd like to contribute to the conversation, as Sabina mentioned, please enter it in the question and answer feature within the WebEx. If you type into that feature, make sure you address who you're trying to have the question for, and what your question is. The format we'll follow here is each presentation will have about 15 minutes to cover their presentation, a few minutes of Q&A, and then we'll move on to the next one. We have a pretty tight schedule today. This afternoon, we'll have a 2-hour open discussion period. So during that open discussion period, all the questions that we've gathered for a presenter will then circle back and address each question that we can in the time we have. So that'll be the model. So if you have a question, please type it in the question and answer. That chat feature, since there's over 560 folks on the line, if everybody is typing in a chat on there, that would be hard for us to manage and route the questions accordingly. So what we've asked you to do is, if you have a question, please type it into the question and answer feature and make sure you put a salutation of who you'd like to address the question for. If we don't get to it in the first session this morning, we'll get to it. We'll try and get to it at the open discussion after in this afternoon, when we have about 2 hours set aside for open discussion. Since this is only a 4-hour workshop, we will have a break for lunch. Since it is only a 4-hour workshop, it's very likely we won't be able to get to every single question as thoroughly as we might hope, or not get to some at all. What we'll do is, after the workshop, make sure we route those questions accordingly and then share the answers to all those post-workshop. So appreciate everybody's understanding on that with the large number of folks on the line. If you do have any sort of technical issues, please email Christian there. He'll make sure to try and run the issue down with you. If you're on the line here, you can type in chat to us if you have an issue, but so far it looks like everybody who is online is able to see the slides, hear the conversation, and we will make sure to address any questions as they come through. So with that, I want to get right into our agenda. And the first presentation we have for you is sort of a scenario review by the National Weather Service. And Todd Beal is on the line to present this. So Todd, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just prompt me and I'll advance the slides, Todd, when you're ready to go to the next one.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Want to first off, thank you for inviting us to participate in the exercise today. We really appreciate the opportunity to brief out the weather portion of the exercise. Would like to recognize the National Hurricane Center. They did provide us with some graphics for this storm. They provided the background information with the track of the storm and produced some nice graphics for us. So we would like to recognize their effort in producing that for us. So my name is Todd Beal with the National Weather Service at the Southern Regional Operations Center in Fort Worth, Texas. I will be briefing out the weather portion of the scenario, and we'll be simulating our normal noon call that we have during a tropical weather event. So that's what we're going to go through here over the next couple minutes. It's a condensed version of what we're normally accustomed to, but it's just a broad overview to set the stage for the exercise. So if you go ahead and advance to the next slide, we'll get into the information with our tropical system. So here's the situation overview with Tropical Storm Locura. It's expected to become a hurricane over the next 24 hours. The latest information we have from the Hurricane Center is it's now forecast to be a major hurricane at landfall, a Category 3 storm with 125-mile-per-hour winds at landfall. The onset of those tropical storm force winds could occur within 48 hours. So the storm as it is right now, it's 40 miles per hour over the central Gulf of Mexico, and the movement of the system is to the west at 8 miles per hour. Now we are expecting this to increase in strength and pretty rapidly into a hurricane over the next 24 hours, and then into a major hurricane as it approaches the Texas coast. There are hurricane and storm surge watches in effect for the Texas coast on Thursday into Friday. And if you look at the image to the left, you see the track forecast with the cone graphic. And I want to draw your attention, if you're on the lower portion of the coast or the extreme upper portion of the coast, you may say, hey, I'm not in the cone, this doesn't impact me or shouldn't impact me, but actually impacts can occur well away from the center of the storm, and sometimes the storm actually deviates from the cone itself. So anybody along the Texas coast is fair game with this tropical system, and we could see tropical impacts anywhere along the Texas coast as we head into Thursday into Friday. So if you advance to the next slide, we want to discuss our threat levels with this tropical system. The main threat will be the strong winds as the hurricane approaches the coast. Again, we could see a major hurricane with 125 mile per hour sustained winds. Some of those gusts will be quite a bit higher than that 125 miles per hour. So a significant storm is approaching the Texas coast. Our secondary threat will be storm surge, and we do have a storm surge watch along the entire Texas coastline. So we'll have some life-threatening storm surge that we'll have to contend with as well. In addition, we will have the threat for some heavy rainfall and some tornadoes, and those could occur well away from the storm center and could extend a decent way inland. So this system will not only impact locations along the coast, it does have an inland threat component to it as well. Our forecast confidence is actually really high with this scenario here. Conditions across the Gulf of Mexico are primed for tropical development and rapid intensification of the system as it progresses westward across the Gulf. So due to those factors, we are extremely confident in the track that we could see with what would become Hurricane Locura. We are expecting hurricane force winds and significant storm surge impacts along the Texas coast. Now, for your local area where you're located, you can go to the National Weather Service office forecast pages there in Houston, Lake Charles, Corpus Christi, and Brownsville to get the latest information for your specific location. So those are great reference information that you can use as the storm approaches for your local area. If you advance to the next slide, please. We'll talk about the tropical storm force winds. What you're seeing on this image is the earliest reasonable time of tropical storm force winds. That time frame you see along the Texas coastline is Thursday evening. That is the earliest reasonable chance that the tropical storm force winds would arrive. However, the most likely time that these winds will arrive will be overnight Thursday into Friday morning. So you have a couple of time frames to keep in mind. The earliest reasonable time, Thursday evening, but the most likely time, Thursday night into Friday morning. Now, those greatest chances for tropical storm force winds will reside from Corpus Christi Bay to Galveston Bay, and that's anywhere greater than a 70% chance of tropical storm force winds at any one location between Corpus Christi Bay and Galveston Bay. Not pictured is the chance of hurricane force winds, but those are greatest near Matagorda Bay at this time. This is based on this current forecast from the Hurricane Center. I would like to caution you or advise you guys to monitor the trends with these hurricane and tropical storm wind speed probabilities. So they could actually increase as the subsequent forecasts come out. So pay special attention to how your trends are behaving at your location with the threat of these tropical storm force and hurricane force winds. If you'd advance to the next slide, please. We'll discuss the storm surge threat. Again, there's a storm surge threat across the entire Texas coastline. There's a storm surge watch in effect. For the storm surge watch, there is the potential for life-threatening storm surge, and that's water above normally dry ground within 48 hours. And that number we use is 3 feet. So greater than 3 feet of water above normally dry ground will be possible within the next 48 hours. And that timing is, for the greatest threat, would be Thursday night into Friday as the system approaches the coast. If you advance to the next slide, we'll just sum up with our key takeaways for the scenario. Hurricane force winds and significant surge impacts will be likely to the upper and middle Texas coast. Again, but we'd like to stress at any one point along the Texas coast is still under the gun from this tropical system. These impacts may begin as early as Thursday evening, and hurricane and storm surge watches are now in effect for the Texas coastline. In addition to the tropical threats of the surge and the winds, we are expecting the potential for very heavy rainfall and tornadoes, and that threat could also extend well inland beyond the coast. That wraps up the scenario briefing. I'll stand by for questions. Thank you again for letting us brief out the weather portion of the scenario.
Thank you, Todd. Only questions so far are just about the slides. Yes, we will get the slides out to folks after this workshop. Right now, we've only got them on the WebEx. So we'll move forward here. Just contact information there. I'll leave that up for a few beats here if you want to capture down email addresses or telephone numbers or websites. The next presentation is from Gisela Ryan Bunger on the State Operations Center. So Gisela, you should have the ability to unmute yourself.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear. Thank you.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us in this exercise. As we continue to respond to COVID, obviously COVID will probably be with us through, we're looking at into a large portion of the hurricane season, and so we have to adapt our planning and our responses accordingly. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit this morning about the State Operations Center and support for the storm. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we really don't have any significant changes of how the State Operations Center is going to respond as far as our processes are concerned. However, we do have some additional considerations, and one of those obviously is as we respond to COVID and we incorporate social distancing, we've had to establish two State Operations Center locations. And so we have the main SOC, which is here at the DPS complex, and then we have the remote SOC, which is at an alternate location. And so we sort of have our COVID-19 response agencies and partners sort of spread out between the two locations. We don't envision that to be any different for our upcoming, for any hurricane response or for this hurricane response. It just becomes a little bit more challenging in making sure that we connect all the massive complex pieces when it comes to the states responding. So one of the big things that we had to do, very much like our local partners, is that we had to take a look at all of our operational planning documents. We had to make sure that they included COVID-19 considerations and that those have been applied and adjusted to our planning assumptions to make sure that we're taking best practices and recommendations from the CDC, our Department of State Health Services, and others. So one of the things that we also have to look at is we have to adjust our timelines to account for additional lengths of time that we may need to get resources because of COVID-19. And that's going to result in decisions being made much, much earlier than we would normally make them. And especially when we start looking at state resources, pre-positioning decisions, all of those things are going to have to occur a little bit earlier so that we can ensure timely deployment. And then we have to make sure that because we don't know of a lot of our state resources and local resources that we activate to support the state's response, we have to make sure that those personnel are available and have not, and their organizations have not been impacted by COVID. And of course, the big thing is as the supply chain does continue to get better, we kind of know what happens when we start preparing. We have a storm in the Gulf of Mexico. There are, challenges on the supply chain as people, buy and start, stockpiling, needed resources. So that's going to require us to make sure that we initiate our procurement actions a lot earlier than we normally would. Next slide, please. So we have to take a look at a number of our state contracts to make sure that those contractors have made needed adjustments to incorporate COVID-19 precautions. One of those, of course, is our base camp contract for our responder base camp. The other one is our bus contract to make sure that we have a good understanding on how buses are going to be deployed and how many buses are going to be needed in order to assist with state-provided evacuation. And probably one of the biggest issues is going to be as we support state evacuation, it's going to double the number and maybe even triple the number of buses that we're going to need in order to effect that evacuation because of social distancing requirements on those buses. And so that's going to mean that we're going to need our local jurisdictions to start looking at their timelines to make sure that those decisions are made early enough so that the bus contractor is going to be able to acquire, the state's going to be able to acquire those additional needed resources that we normally wouldn't have to have if we weren't looking at COVID. The state's also developing its stockpile of PPE to support evacuation, shelter operations, and other state response activity as needed. So as we put different state agencies and responders into our local jurisdictions to support their needs, we have to make sure that we have appropriate PPE to protect them. Establishing wellness screening stations at all state response operations. We have to make sure that we're maintaining the health and safety of our responders, and so it's going to require additional resources and personnel to be able to establish these different wellness screening sites that we're going to have in all, whether it be safe camps, staging areas, RSAs, you name it. So we'll have to implement those kinds of protections. And then, of course, we're going to have to make sure that we maximize the use of our interstate mutual aid, which is EMAC, to fill personnel shortages in the event that we have agency personnel who are not able to respond, and we can reach out to our neighboring states within Region 6 under the emergency support, interstate emergency support plan, which is our Region 6 partners, and then EMAC across the rest of the country to support any response needs for the state of Texas. Next slide. Okay. Questions, I guess we're ready for our question period.
Yes, Gisela, there was one question that came in terms of how much advance notice are you thinking of as COVID will limit movement, as you shared on both supplies, et cetera?
So a lot of our contracts are 48, 32 hours. We're going to have to activate those a little bit sooner to make sure that the number and the quantity of resources we are going to need can be acquired by those vendors. So we're looking at probably an additional 12 hours onto the current contract that I'm making the decision to activate those contracts.
Okay, great. Thanks. We didn't have any other questions come in from the group. I'll pause just one moment if anybody was typing, because we've got a few minutes here. Question then, Gisela, for those assisting cities who support shelters, do we request PPE from the state?
I think we're going to talk about that in another presentation, so I'm not going to steal that presenter's thunder.
Okay.
And if we don't address it, go ahead and submit it, and we'll make sure that we address it during the 2-hour question-answer session.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What does the PPE stockpile look like right now?
So this is Mike Miller, Deputy Chief for TDM. The stockpile is significant. We have it in several different locations across the state of Texas. So I believe we'll be able to meet your needs, no matter if you're sheltering or evacuation hub across the state of Texas as of now. Over.
Thank you, sir. We've got time for one more question here. Thoughts on assisting the elderly in nursing homes? Do we have comment from this group, or shall we save that for another presentation?
What's the question regarding the nursing home?
Just thoughts on a general comment on assisting elderly in nursing homes. Why don't we save that one for this afternoon?
Yes, I agree. I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other folks who've typed in questions, I'm going to keep us on schedule. We'll make sure to document these and circle back to them in the open discussion. Please make sure at the beginning of your questions to type which presentation you're asking the question about. Our next presentation is an update from the Department of State Health Services. We've got Chris Medina, Jeff, and Michelle on the line. I believe Chris or Jeff, are you kicking it off? You should be able to unmute yourselves.
Hey, good morning. This is Chris Medina, the Director of State Medical Operations Center, currently located here at the State Operations Center. Thank you. I'll be joined later on, probably for the question phase, by Jeff Holguin. So this morning, we're just going to go, next slide, please. And so this morning, we're going to talk a little bit, kind of give you a general overview of talk through medical shelters, talk about embarkation hubs and transportation and some general guidance that we developed, as well as talk through some guidance that about gen pop shelters, and especially during this type of scenario that we're currently in with the COVID type of environment. So I'll go through it fairly quickly, but definitely there'll be opportunity to ask questions later on and or during the facilitated discussion. So, you know, real briefly, we are working. So if you don't get your question answered here, or if I don't cover it, we are working on a lot of different guidance and toolkits for the local jurisdictions and for the shelter managers, as well as some online training that we're currently developing as well. So you'll definitely have an opportunity to take a look at that later on and do the training as well. So first of all, I want to go ahead and talk about a little bit about the medical shelters. So really, as you all know who've been here in the past, especially during Hurricane Harvey, that hasn't changed. We still have plan on doing state medical shelters operated by one of our great partners, BPFS, and that'll be primarily located in San Antonio. And so we will do evacuations as we have in the past, and that will be kind of the state hub for all of those type of operations. So the goal for those is to remain the same, is to reduce the hospital surge. And so really these are those type of patients that don't need really the high level of hospital criteria. So they are on a little bit of lower one, and then so we are going to and be able to put them into the medical shelters and where they really need actual medical care on a daily basis. And so that is kind of the focus for these medical shelters. Also, currently, we have plans on providing up to 5,000 bed capacity across the shelters within San Antonio in different locations. Currently, we are going to leverage the Freeman Coliseum, where we currently have an alternative care site, which is currently in a warm status. And so we do have that online for us to be used as a medical shelter if we need to during a hurricane. And so that facility has been up in a warm status probably for the last at least 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and it's going to stay in that status probably throughout the foreseeable future to support especially hurricane operations during the summer. So in there, you know, they have set up to separate the different patients, and they have all the infection controls and all the PPE measures all incorporated into that setup, and they'll be able to provide that. If needed, there is a portion in there that does have negative pressure to separate COVID positive patients that have a medical need where they're not required to go into the hospital. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that later. In addition, we are looking at hotels and other different types of facilities, and our CCID campus which is also located in San Antonio to help with these type of operations as well. Moving on, next slide, please. Embarkation hubs and transportation. So we are partnering with TDM and BCFS to develop a couple of toolkits that I alluded to earlier and strategies. And so there will be a embarkation hub toolkit that BCFS is currently working on for us. We're looking at the beginning of July for that to be ready and to for us to send that out to everybody to take a look at. And additionally, looking at different types of screening tools that you can use at these embarkation hubs, and as well as embarkation hub training, especially, of course, during this type of environment, in COVID. And right now, it's going to be, we're looking at an online type of training where you can go ahead and log in, you can receive the training. It'll take you probably no longer than 30 minutes, and that'll be widely available to really anybody who needs it. For evacuation transportation, you know, currently we still have the same plans that we had previously in previous hurricanes. We are going to use EMTF as our primary resource, provide ambulances, ambulance, aeromedical type of support. Like we did during Hurricane Harvey, we may have to also activate and request the federal ambulance contract, and we're prepared to do that if needed. And then for non-medical transportation, I know TDM has contracts that are existing. We are looking at, as part of these and putting them on each of these different buses, are bus infection control kits. And so that's something that we've been working on for the last couple of weeks. We're looking at right now, they're out for a contractor to build these kits. You can see in there generally what these kits consist of. And so what we'll do with those kits is we'll provide them to all the buses, most likely at the bus staging area in San Antonio, and provide those as needed throughout the hurricane operation. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the interim guidance for evacuation transportation. Really, it's a lot of this is nothing new. It's things that I think everybody has heard about throughout the last several months dealing with COVID. They'll go into a little bit more detail in toolkits and training, but they're generally the same type of guidelines, and we're just looking at focusing them on, in this case, transportation. So definitely social distancing on transportation, whether that means you know, occupying every other row on the bus or on the plane, going in one door, coming out a separate door, reducing the occupancy of the number of folks that you put on these type of vehicles, providing different types of guides on these vehicles to kind of help maintain the social distances. You know, that will all be incorporated and is highly recommended while we're doing operations, and especially with the buses. Next slide, please. A little bit about the embarkation hubs. Kind of the same kind of concepts as well. This one's actually a little bit more about the vehicles. Of course, providing PPE, and then emphasizing hygiene, and then providing those kits that I talked about earlier, and providing them for the buses for folks to use on the buses. Next slide, please. A little bit more about the evacuation. So we do, you know, there should be plans also to use separate types of vehicles to transport different types of folks. Definitely, if somebody does need medical attention, we will use medical transportation for that, whether it's ambulance or ambus, or if it needs to be aeromedical, we will plan on doing that. Of course, the buses won't be a substitute for that. And then, of course, after the transportation is used, just focusing on cleaning and disinfecting those different types of transportation methods. Now moving on to Gen Pop shelters. Just again, a couple of just key points. Looking at, again, the layout, the specific layout of the general population shelter. Kind and addressing, you know, folks that arrive, whether they arrive symptomatic, whether they arrive asymptomatic, and what to do with them as they come in. Specifically having a type of intake area where they can come in, you intake them, and then you identify whether they can go into the general population area or if they have to be put into an isolation type of area. And those will be outlined in the toolkits and in the training as well. And so as part of this as well, just like we did with the bus infection control kits, we are working with a contractor, a vendor, to develop shelter infection control kits. And so they'll have kind of the same themes that the bus infection control kits will. And so we're working on those. We'll probably have those all available and ready to issue out here within the next couple of weeks, and we'll issue them out to shelters as required. But it'll include PPE and different types of sanitizing equipment as well. And so as part of this, again, we are developing a toolkit and guidance on how to operate a Gen Pop shelter in this type of environment. And then we are working on additionally computer-based training, online training that local jurisdictions and shelter managers are going to be able to take as well. Moving on to the next slide. Just a couple of other, so, you know, kind of one of the emphasis is trying to do operations a little bit differently, and instead of maybe a 500-person congregate type of shelter, as much as possible, trying to use alternatives and have folks individually put into different locations. For example, in hotels or dormitories, campgrounds have also been recommended by CDC as somewhere where you can put folks into different types of cabins. And then if we had to, congregate shelters, trying to limit the number of personnel around 50, kind of the recommendation by CDC, and try not to have these mega shelters that we've used in the past. And definitely prevention is kind of definitely one of the key things that we want to incorporate as well. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides talk a little bit about the intake area. I'm not going to go into full details on the intake area, but again, just a couple of items for intake area on how they should be kind of set up and some of the guidelines and things that you should think about for the intake areas into the Gen Pop shelters. Next slide, please. And then moving on into the isolation area, if you do identify somebody, you know, with symptoms, high temperature or whatever, having a isolation area within the Gen Pop shelter where you can put those folks in there and monitor them as well. Next slide, please. And then kind of, you know, the big thing, of course, is monitoring those types of individuals and determining whether you're going to keep them there or if they're going to need additional assistance. If they do need, of course, medical types of assistance, then we would move them to either a hospital and or to a medical shelter if it's available. So again, it's kind of fast and furious, a little bit limited on time, but kind of wanted to give you kind of the big overview points for this. Again, we are going to be pushing out some toolkits and some training here very shortly, and we'll make sure that's pushed out to all the local jurisdictions that need it. And I'll go ahead and we can go ahead and stop for questions.
Okay, thanks, Chris. A couple questions here, and I just want to go through them with the order I got them in. Is there a plan to screen evacuees at embarkation areas? If they're symptomatic evacuees are found, will they go to medical shelters?
Hey, Chris, this is Jeff. So evacuees at the embarkation hub, and the detail will be included in the training and the tools for hub managers I anticipate, we'll do the screening that we've always done to determine if someone's a medical evacuee, meaning they receive on a regular basis licensed, credentialed medical care at their home or wherever, and they don't need to go to a hospital, but they exceed the acuity capacity of the Gen Pop shelter. And so we'll do that kind of screening. So you're either a medical evacuee or a Gen Pop evacuee, the way we normally do. But in addition to that, there'll be that COVID screening. So the scenarios that I foresee are people could show up as known positive, meaning they're in isolation because they have at their home or wherever in the community because they've been diagnosed a confirmed lab confirmed case. They might be in quarantine because they've been exposed to a lab confirmed case, or they could be just mildly symptomatic. But those groups of people, our guidance would be that they should be cohorted together on their own transportation asset. That not to say that's going to go anywhere different than the other transportation. If the buses in that community are destined for Tyler, those buses will still go to Tyler, but that group of people will be cohorted together. And when they get to the Gen Pop shelter in Tyler in this scenario, there would be, again, a tool and some guidance we've created for shelter managers to show how you sort, and you'll probably need to rescreen the people when they get there, but then sort the people who need isolation and quarantine type sheltering versus people who can be in the larger general population group. And I'll say that, remind everybody, there is likely a large asymptomatic positive group of people out there. And so even in that group that was not identified at the embarkation hub as being isolation or quarantine population, there could be people that are in the normal population that could be positive. And so infection control and spacing and modifications to both types of shelters is important because of the COVID-19 environment we're in. Over.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Got time for one or two more questions here before the next presentation. Just a simple statement here of if people can fill airplanes without social distancing, why is it required on evacuation buses? Just talk a little bit about the difference between airplane social distancing and evacuation buses.
So this is Jeff again. I haven't flown since COVID, so there are probably people on this call that know more about what aircraft and airplane operators are doing. But I will tell you that from a public health perspective, our guidance would certainly be that in all instances where we're putting people who have not been together and we're putting them together in a bus or a shelter or any type of other situation, that social distancing is a cornerstone, one of the cornerstones of stopping the spread of COVID-19. And so our guidance will be that there will and should be additional space put between evacuees in transportation and also in shelter environments. And so it is again something that we're recommending, something that we know works. That in conjunction with infection control and other types of strategies, but distancing is one of the cornerstones.
Thanks, Jeff. Will the intent be for locals to utilize any of their local transportation to assist with the state evacuation?
Hi, this is Gisela. Absolutely. Remember, we like locals to use their resources first, and then the state's resources are there to support them to fill any gaps. So, yeah, I know we have a number of our coastal jurisdictions who have the use of school buses in their plan. So, yes, the answer is yes.
Great. One other question I think we can get in before we have to move on to the next presentation. Are there specially trained and equipped custodial contracts to clean and sanitize general population shelters?
So this is Jeff. I can talk a little bit to that. So certainly at the state level, we have or have access to contracts that can do the type of cleaning I think that you're asking about. We certainly have had some experience with that during our response to Ebola when it was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That said, and this is my thought is that the local sheltering operations, the operation of that shelter, including the secondary and tertiary supporting activities are organized at the local level. So if a local sheltering jurisdiction needs assistance with that type of cleaning or any other type of operation that supports the shelter, I think we would want to know ahead of time so we could plan for that. So there are contracts out there, but I don't know that that's our plan, and that we need to provide that assistance.
Great, thanks. There are a few other questions that we've collected, but we need to move on to the next presentation to stay on track here. So we'll gather those unanswered questions and comments, put them in a common sheet so that we can address them this afternoon during the open discussion. So if you still were typing a question for the folks at DSHS, please just make sure you preface your comment with that it's for them, and we'll make sure we route it appropriately this afternoon. So appreciate that. Our next presentation comes from Texas Animal Health Commission. Holly, are you able to unmute yourself?
I am. Can you hear me?
Great. Yep.
All right. Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Holly Tejan-Hill with the Texas Animal Health Commission. And today we're going to talk about animal issues in hurricanes and, what we typically encounter and how any of that has changed as we collectively plan for a response during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So as we all know, these are the main areas of interest that we, the animal folks, plan for and encounter in hurricane scenarios. Most of these are common to planning for humans, therefore many of the considerations for animal response in the midst of COVID-19 are going to go hand in hand with sorting out the people piece. Next slide. So let's talk about COVID-19 and how it has specifically altered any of the planning we've been doing. So by working with some of the local state mass care and other partners, such as Red Cross, we've had important discussions and that have been had, and adjustments and amendments to our plans have been made. The primary focus has been on best practices in evacuation and sheltering to best maintain the current guidelines on social distancing and limitation of disease spread. So generally speaking, any practices that jurisdictions put in place to achieve this for humans, the same will pretty well be for animal planning as well. For example, just as been mentioned before, there's going to be a limited number of people per evacuation bus. So you can apply that to the animals as well. Fewer people, fewer animals per bus. So when it comes to sheltering, the first choice would be that of hotels, specifically pet-friendly hotels. And then we move into the next choice would be congregated sheltering. If that is necessary, then co-located would be a little more optimal than cohabited, and know that space will be limited more than usual. We know that that can be, that's going to be a thing. However, it all really comes down to what the jurisdiction can support while practicing safe public health. We all know that resources will be limited. So in your planning efforts, when you figure out how much PPE your responders and volunteers are going to need, please don't forget your animal responders. They're part of that response crew as well. If your animal issues committee has not yet met on responding with COVID-19 considerations in mind, now's the time. There's a little plug for that. Figuring out the animal piece, and this is very important as well, so get your animal issues committees together to start those planning. Next slide, please. So as always, whether it be at the local, regional, or state level, the animal piece is handled by a very capable group of partners. As you can see here, we've listed some. At the local level, it's these folks and others tied together through that animal issues committee. When resources need to gather at the state level, it is accomplished with our Animal Response Operations Coordination Center, or AROC, at our TAHC headquarters. We can do that either virtually or in person, depending on the size, scope, and of course, right now, COVID-19. So we can do that virtually if we need to. Next slide. Just to show you what that looks like, this was our AROC during Hurricane Harvey, and we are ready to stand that up again if need be. and bring all of our partners in either in person or virtually. And we would, of course, do social distancing if we had to do that. We also have our representatives at the SOC. Next slide, please. And just for those of you who need a little refresher, here's a representation of the local response and where the animal piece is tied into the overall response. Over there on the lower left, you see the Animal Issues Branch. You have the Animal Issues Branch under Operations, and someone from the Animal Issues Committee will represent the animal group and will report up what is happening in the animal response. So there are several things to consider, kind of in summary, but here's a few when you're thinking of the animal piece. You know, consider that you will probably have reduced levels of staff and volunteers. I think that's going to go for everyone, not just the animal piece. Consider the fact that your jurisdiction may already be financially taxed, so keep that in mind when you're doing your animal planning. And it may be difficult to get the same level of resources from the state and feds as you normally might. So keep that in mind as well. So when it comes to, you know, needing some help from state or federal level, that may be reduced a little bit as well. So one of the things I wanted to mention as well is we talked about, you know, in light of COVID, sanitation being very important. I know for our agency, as well as many of our partner agencies that deal with animals and partners that deal with animals every day, whether it be animal control officers or veterinarians, sanitation and biosecurity has always been important to us. It's always been at the forefront of our minds. So, you know, it's not something that's new to us. So I think when all of the planning is occurring going forward for this scenario, I think we'll be pretty well prepared. So really, to end, I want to say the good news is that there is federal guidance for local jurisdictions, and that will be coming out soon. We know for sure there are 2 guidance documents coming from the federal level, and so once we get a hold of those and they're ready to be released, we can send that out to this group somehow. One of them is a joint document from the American Red Cross and the National Animal Rescue and Sheltering Coalition. And then we know that USDA is also working on a guidance document. So hopefully those will be out soon and we can get those out to local jurisdictions. And also in the meantime, before that, you can call on us and we can talk you through some things here at the Texas Animal Health Commission. And as always, our partners with the Texas A&M Veterinary Emergency Team, they can always help as well with planning for this specific scenario. So please reach out to us. We'll be glad to help y'all. And if you plan now and utilize all these resources, we think everyone will be pretty well prepared. So that's all I have, and we'll stand by for questions.
Okay. Any questions? Anybody typing in any questions on the chat or Q&A? We didn't have any come in. Holly, during the presentation, we'll give it a minute or 2 there. Otherwise, we can tee up Colonel Hart from the Texas Military Department, and we'll be sure to gather discussion and questions that come in for you for this afternoon.
Okay, thank you.
Just give it one more beat to see if anybody was finishing typing their question, but it doesn't look like it. So, Colonel Hart, are you on the line and able to unmute yourself?
I'm here.
Great. We can hear you.
By the way, that was the best picture ever on the last slide. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Colonel Hart. I'm the Deputy J357 for the Texas Military Department, and typically the lead when we talk about domestic response operations. For everybody's situational awareness, during this hurricane season, our Texas Military Department will have approximately 1,200 people dedicated to the Southwest for security border operations. We also have about 1,900 people unavailable due to overseas deployment. Having said that, that should not affect any of our response capabilities whatsoever, and be able to meet the needs that we have throughout this, as we call it, extended validation exercise that's been going on for about the last 110 days. We have updated our MRP catalog. We're no longer using the 1819 version. We have version 20.1, and we've discontinued the annual updates. Basically, we're only going to make updates to our catalogs as we go forward if we have a capability gap that is identified. The most significant change or update to the catalog for this year was the addition of a general support unit, which is a 30-person general purpose labor element that can do most tasks that need to be done. They don't have any specialized training or equipment, but that doesn't mean they can't receive the specialized training that they need to accomplish specific tasks. This does not change any of our ground transportation companies or our distribution companies or our medical companies that typically we use in hurricane response. During the pre-incident, next slide. So we break this down. We break it down into 3 phases for brevity. I'm not going to belabor each of the 3 phases of the 3 phases. But during phase 1, we consider this, what we're focusing on is learning our forces and conducting pre-operations maintenance check and services on the necessary equipment. Bottom line is we're making sure that our forces are ready when the state and our partners need them. Specifically, as the weather threat increases and our partner needs or require it, we will scale our adaptive staff to include and mobilize our BBCLNOs. We'll stand up joint task force mission command elements in each of the sectors, and then we'll also stage anticipated mission command ready packages. Some more specific COVID considerations that we're looking at for this year in this hurricane season coming up is all of our service members undergoing a pre-mission screening per DoD and CDC guidelines to make sure that we're not sending sick people into the fray. And then we also have load plans for each of our vehicles, which will include both service member and community member protective equipment. So essentially disposable masks for each of the people that we'll be putting on our vehicles that they can keep to help limit the spread of COVID. Next slide. During phase 2, this normally includes our initial response, our deployment of forces, and our transition to sustained response operations. And this is typically where we do all of our surge. We don't foresee any normal changes or any changes to the normal standard STAR request / approval system that we have in place. And for time's sake, I want to reiterate that. I'll save it for the comments and questions. But due to limited ability for us to be able to conduct collective training this year, we do anticipate the need to conduct any just-in-time training for any specific mission, the ground search and rescue or high water, fast water moving type of stuff like that. We're going to have to do specialized training prior to doing those missions. This shouldn't impact our typical response timelines or our typical capabilities that are requested. And then specific effects on response. All of our transportation assets, both air and ground, will be stocked with disposable masks, as stated, for the community members we transport. Our large fixed-wing aircraft, our C-130s, will require deliberate disinfection between lifts, and that probably will limit our lift capacity there, but our rotary wing and ground lift assets can be disinfected by the crews at the end of each mission day. So we don't anticipate a significant impact there. We also anticipate increased need for our shelter teams. Social distance, we are figuring that we won't be able to house the right number of people in each of those teams as we go forward and sheltered in place. Next slide. Okay, and then for our recovery and transition, generally assumed that this phase occurs following in some period of time. At this point, we're in the 100-day category of the current response. Will support no longer really necessary by TDAM, and we can start to redeploy our forces. Some of the factors of this as we go forward is it will take an increased amount of time for us to test our forces as they go off. We'll do testing to ensure that they're not bringing the sickness back into their communities. And then we'll also have, for any of those soldiers that test, or excuse me, service members that test positive, we'll have to keep them on orders and then isolate them prior to sending them back home. This may increase our reset time for being able to go back into any storms that circulate again. And then also we'll have to extend and pay for orders for anybody that does test positive. So in closing, essentially, we don't foresee our ability to fill any gaps for our partner agencies to be limited. some of our ability to reset might be limited, but we don't see what we have been able to do for Texas being affected in any way.
Okay, Colonel Hart, just want to check off a few questions here. Will TMD emergency tracking network teams be available for evacuating and receiving jurisdictions?
Absolutely. We don't foresee any limitation on our ability to do what we do. If there's a problem, let's say the teams are normally in a at-risk category, then we'll, like I said, just-in-time training and get additional forces and that can fill that bill.
Mm-hmm. And if additional shelter locations need to be opened, TMD will be able to support with that?
Again, yes. We have dedicated shelter teams that are currently trained. If we exceed our capability with those shelter teams in any way, we have the general support units, which we stood up specifically for this. Those teams they don't have trucks, they don't have equipment, anything specialized, but they can do and fall in on any capability gaps that we have and our preset limits. Hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Any other questions coming into chat or Q&A for TMD? Don't have any at the moment. I do want to circle back. Holly, are you still on the line?
I am.
Okay, great. Since we have a few minutes before our scheduled lunch break at the top of the hour, I wanted to give you a couple chances here to address a couple of the questions. Will animals be evacuated with? Yep. Okay.
Yes. So the first question, will animals be evacuated with or without people at owner request or area search in coordination with law enforcement? And so if anyone from the state who actually, operates the buses and that, if they want to chime in as well. But from our viewpoint, the greatest risk of COVID-19 during this has been person to person. So it's only been occasional human transmission to animals that's been documented. So the animals being a concern for disease transmission to humans has been low to none. So with that, there shouldn't be a problem with animals being able to be evacuated with their person. So now, at owner request or area search in coordination with law enforcement, I'm not really sure what what they're suggesting with law enforcement being involved, but we can circle back around to that later. What is the temporary shelter plan for evacuation of at-risk populations of small and large animals? So I'm assuming that question is for folks who are at high risk or they're at-risk populations that need to be sheltered differently. So that local jurisdiction is going to have to figure out where they could temporarily shelter small and or large animals, where they'd have to be cared for by someone other than their owner. And then the animal identification and record keeping process. So when animals are being evacuated, through the bus scenario, so ETN tracking system can track the animals. There is a section in there for animals. And so they will be tied to their owners when they get to where they're going. There is basic information in there that you can put about each animal, but I know that the state is, I think, they're in the process of making that a more detailed in the system. But for now, yes, the animals can be tracked in that. Is there a process in place for individuals dropping off pets to shelter areas, social distancing? So yes, this is in the plans for, and especially in some of that federal guidance we've seen so far. Yes, all all of the animal shelters within the jurisdiction will be adhering to social distancing practices. Absolutely. There's no difference there. I know that's kind of in general to answer those questions, but we can, if those aren't good enough, we can find more detail and come back around to it.
Okay, we actually had one come in, Holly. Would animals ever be evacuated separately from their owners?
I have not heard of that being a scenario that we would be looking at. If someone from the state has anything other than that, but we have not discussed that would need to happen for any reason.
This is Gisela. We agree with you, Holly.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We had a question come in. I'm going to have to read you this live so that I can share the comment with you. Just ran a shelter in a hotel, and some of the people with pets had dogs in the rooms. Need rules for people with pets in rooms. Many of the clients are not familiar with staying in hotels and with pets, and there's sort of an opportunity to mess up the space. So just a general comment there, likely from a hotel or shelter.
And yes, that's something that could happen, and we've anticipated that that's a possibility. So the local jurisdictions are going to have those discussions up front with the hotels that have offered their services and try to work that one out.
Great, thanks, Holly. No other questions came in. Sabine, we've got about 19 minutes until our scheduled lunch break. We can either take that break now or circle back to some other questions from previous presentations. Just wanted to see if you had a preference there.
We might, yeah, I think we're good with taking a break right now. It's we've been sitting for quite a while, so I think that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's add these 19 minutes to our lunch break.
Our lunch break.
Thank you so much for everybody that has been on this and has been asking questions. If you have other questions, we're going to keep this going. So if you want to add more questions to the chat room, please feel free to do so. And I believe at 12:30 is when we're going to start up with mass care with Jessica with the Red Cross. And I would just say let's go ahead and take a few more minutes lunch. It's not like we have to congregate at a restaurant, but it does help.
Okay, yes, that's great. So folks on the line, you can leave this session open if you choose, or you can close it and rejoin, but I would recommend it just to maintain the stability of it, leave it open in the background while you go grab lunch. But we'll start again promptly at 12:30 Central Time. Continuing, if you would like to, during that break, type in questions to the chat. We'll make sure to add that to the open discussion in the afternoon. So we will keep this chat and Q&A open as well. So 12:30 Central Time, we'll reconvene for the American Red Cross presentation.
That sounds great. Thank you, Doug.
So for those who've just rejoined, we're getting started in another minute here. Hope everybody had a great lunch. We're going to start with the American Red Cross presentation in 1 minute. Just to orient everybody with what we did over lunch break, we grabbed all the questions and discussion points that came in that we did not get to during the during the morning session and have distributed those to the presenters so that during the open discussion session after the presentations, we can circle back on and go through those discussion questions. So appreciate everybody submitting those. As a reminder, please submit questions to the Q&A feature rather than chat. If you send it to chat and just to the host, there's only one person monitoring that, whereas we have several monitoring the Q&A section, and we can more easily route the questions that way. With that, I have 12:35 Central Time. And let me advance to the next slide here. Jess, if you wanted to take it away.
Great, thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessica Dabalski, and I'm the State Director for the American Red Cross. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some information about how the Red Cross has adjusted our procedures for COVID-19. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
There we go.
Okay, great. So back in January, when COVID-19 really started to impact the U.S., we began having discussions internally to determine what our mission essential functions would be, since we knew that the pandemic would impact our ability to respond. So there are three areas that we're focusing on right now across the country and obviously here in the state of Texas. The first are house fires. So house fires are the most common disaster we respond to across the state, and it really is a big part of our mission to ensure that people have a safe place to stay, and those services will continue throughout the pandemic. Whenever possible, we're utilizing virtual responses by phone, and all of our volunteers who do respond in person are adhering to social distancing and ensuring that they have the proper PPE whenever they respond. Our second mission focus area is blood services. So as an organization, the Red Cross supplies 40% of the nation's blood supply. So we're continuing our blood testing services with hospitals and local blood banks, and then also continuing drives. And then we have entered into a program with the FDA to do a convalescent plasma in order to identify treatment options for COVID-19. And finally, our third mission essential function is, as the mass care co-lead with FEMA, we're still responding to sheltering, feeding, distribution of emergency supplies, and reunification services. Next slide, please. So we've been monitoring public health declarations in counties across the state and have adjusted our response activities depending on the severity of the cases that are reported. So when you see higher level of restrictions, that will start to directly impact the services that we have offered. So we have a scaling system where as it gets worse and the pandemic cases rise, then that will start to impact, we'll have less services available. And then whenever those cases start to go back down, then we'll be able to shift back into adding additional programs. To ensure the safety of our workforce, our offices are currently closed across the state, closed to the public, minus, again, those blood services and disaster services. And we've also instituted a screening process for all of our responders and people that may be going into the office, and we have additional sanitation procedures that are also in place. Next slide, please. So now I'll highlight kind of each area of mass care and how we've adjusted our procedures for COVID-19. So with sheltering, we're going to be working really closely with both emergency management and public health on any and all shelter operations. That is going to be a crucial relationship to help us determine what the best course of action is for that specific disaster. For feeding, we've shifted to more of an individually packaged meal model, and we're not serving food in giant food lines. So typically you would see us serving meals out of giant Cambros and food lines. And as you know, many of our buffet style type feeding is not really going to be the best during this pandemic. And so that's why we've shifted to those individually boxed meals. Think like a Jason's Deli lunch and individual meals like those where you can pass those out to the clients. We definitely want to promote social distancing and eliminate people congregating in areas. So we will be adjusting when we do open shelters, kind of what that feeding schedule will look like and staggering in people throughout that feeding time period. And then also as an example of how we're including social distancing, we'll be placing meals on a table, the volunteer will step back, and then the client will step forward to grab their meal. So just so that we have additional distance between our volunteers who are responding as well as the clients that we're serving. For the distribution of emergency supplies, so our focus is going to shift just a little bit this hurricane season, and the supplies that we'll be distributing are really going to be targeted towards helping clients transition from shelters to where they can stay inside of their home. So that will impact the types of items that we do pass out, but that really is our targeted distribution so that we can help move our clients out of any congregate sheltering setting into a situation where they're able to stay in their home. We also are going to be looking at shifting to more driveway drops or pod distribution rather than having that typical in-person, person-to-person contact. So again, having additional space. With our reunification services, most of that is done through our online website, the Safe and Well system. So those services will continue. If we do get into a situation where we have a larger family reunification that does require in-person, we'll again work with those emergency management as well as public health on making sure that we're as safe as possible. We do have a requirement that all in-person services must be supported by some type of health services professional, so either a Red Cross Disaster Health Services volunteer, a member from our public health, Medical Reserve Corps. There's a variety of different persons that can support, but anything that does take place in person will have some type of health services professional there on site. Next slide, please.
Jessica, are you there? I've got the congregate versus non-congregate shelters.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I had a delay on my end. Sorry about that. So now let's talk a little bit about shelters specifically. So our new model is to utilize non-congregate sheltering options as our first choice when we need to open a shelter. So those types of options include hotels or motels. Holly mentioned earlier that we're doing a specific outreach to identifying hotels that have pet policies or allow a pet deposit for the animal to come in. If those options have been exhausted, then we'll look at university or college dormitory areas where you have the individual rooms for families and people to be sheltered in. And then we also have started utilizing campgrounds, which work really well for larger families. Most campground cabins can accommodate anywhere between 6 to 12 people, depending on their layout. And so that's also going to be a much better option for us rather than congregate options. So we know that based on past experiences and other disasters that we may exhaust non-congregate options in the community, and we may actually have to shift to opening congregate shelter settings. So that decision, whenever it is made, will be made in concert with public health and emergency management, before we take action. And we've issued new guidance to our shelter teams to ensure we're taking protective measures recommended by the CDC and adhering to any standards that have come down for a safe sheltering experience. Next slide, please. So this is how a congregate shelter will look this hurricane season with COVID-19. So it all kind of starts at the screening process. So we have put in our guidance that we will have a screening process and an isolation care area that we set up in that shelter. Ideally, again, every decision that we make will be in concert with public health and emergency management. We've equipped our shelter kits and our volunteers with thermometers so that we can screen people before they even arrive inside of the shelter. And we also do want to let everyone know that we do have a limitation with just the number of supplies and the number of volunteers that we have. And so if we don't have health services volunteers and we don't have any other partner agency that can support us when we do have the shelter, a congregate shelter that opens, then that definitely we want to work together to make sure that we have a professional on site to be as safe as possible. Next, when we shift into actually setting up the shelter, so a new thing that we'll be doing is providing masks, tissues, plastic bags at all of our screening points, around the registration area, really just kind of throughout the entire shelter. And then that will be dependent upon our supplies. So right now we've got shelter kits that include all of those items that have been pushed out to the field across the state. We have the ability to backfill quite a bit, but that may be a request that we have during the response to help replenish any supplies as we go into a longer-term sheltering event. We will be equipping our shelters with additional hand washing stations. We know that that's one of the best ways to combat this disease. And so those are a couple areas where we'd like to see additional hand washing stations if that facility does not have those already in place. So that may be a request that we would be coming to emergency management with to help support, again, keeping this shelter as safe as possible. Our new cleaning and disinfecting procedures is to clean about every 4 hours. So all of the common areas, restrooms, door handles, all of the areas that are most commonly touched within the shelter is definitely going to be important. And then also the dormitory layout. So we'll have 6 feet between all sides of the cot. That's about 110 square feet per person if you're looking at the distance between people, as well as the 6 feet of distance. And we're also going to be alternating the layout so that we have a head-to-toe configuration, and there's less there's more distance between people being able to spread the virus. This will significantly impact our shelter capacity, so it will reduce that number of what we typically would shelter in a large area. For hurricane sheltering, we really would prefer not to have shelters over 250, maybe 500 people at the very most, just because of the possibility for spread. And then our dormitory actually could be limited even further if we need space for the isolation care area, casework, or any other additional services. Next slide, please.
Should be coming up in a second.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about the isolation care area. So again, working in partnership with our public health to establish that area within the shelter. We want to make sure that again, we have the safest shelter that we possibly can despite all of the COVID-19 challenges. If public health is not available to be on site with us, we know that there may be limitations of staffing and having people available in person. We may be requesting additional N95 masks, gowns, face shields, goggles, and gloves, and any fit testing that goes along with that, just to make sure that our team is safe as possible. Again, all of our health services volunteers already have these kits to start off with, and we have the ability to backfill. But if we get into a situation where we have multiple responses happening throughout the country, that again may be a request that comes to you from the Red Cross so that we can continue to operate that congregate shelter. We'll have an isolation care area with their own hand washing, their own toileting areas, and really, whenever possible, a separate room completely. If that's not available, then we'll do the best that we can to create an isolation care area that has adequate separation between the general public. We'll have separate areas and for medical waste, especially with the PPE that's going to be used in those areas. And whenever possible, we do have a small supply of petition screens so that we can have those between the cots to, again, further limit the spread of the virus. Also did want to make a note about quarantining or isolation. So our public health entity is the only legal authority for quarantine or isolation compliance. What the Red Cross can do is we can ask for clients to isolate voluntarily, or we can put them in the side area, but that's why that partnership with our local public health is going to be really important, that if someone does need to go into any type of quarantine or isolation, that they're the ones that can officially make that decision. Next slide, please. So we've created COVID-19 job tools for each of our positions in the areas of the shelter. These guides are available to you by visiting the National Mass Care Strategy website. I also do want to make the offer that we're available to attend any planning meetings or trainings to share any detailed information or guidance. Today's presentation was meant to be just a high-level overview, but we again have those really detailed job tools for what each person would do and how we're going to be setting these shelters up. My contact information is listed on the slide, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessica. We do have time for a few questions here. Could you reiterate the testing considerations for shelters and hotels?
Testing considerations. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Maybe if we could expand a little bit on the question.
Okay, we can circle back to that one. Just another point then. You mentioned no disaster shelters in areas where there's been a public emergency declared. Does that apply for the whole country now, right at the present moment? And so are Red Cross shelters completely off the plan for 2020?
Yes. So the plan is instituted across the country. So what we're doing is we're monitoring, as we saw over the last couple months, really kind of starting in March, where we had, we had a government-directed social distancing. Many of our counties went to where they started off as just a declared public health emergency. There were a few items that were put in place, like social distancing. Then the government started directing very specific social distancing measures, and then we shifted even further into government-ordered shelter-in-place. So whenever those orders go into effect, and especially in our state, when the county judges start signing those, that will limit our services, because those are the actions that we're also being told to take. And so that's why we'll be working with that local public health and that local emergency manager to make sure that we both have clarity, or all of us have clarity on when we have a shelter-in-place order, that's been issued, we don't want to open a shelter and go against that. And so that's why sheltering is not off the table for hurricane season, or really during the pandemic. It's going to be more of a coordinated conversation. Ideally, we'll start with those non-congregate options like a hotel, and then we'll shift into opening a congregate shelter if it's needed, because some of our communities don't have as many resources for non-congregate, and that may be our only option. And so that's how we'll address it. But it'll be more on a case-by-case basis. When we have a larger hurricane size operation, we know that we will probably have a combination of non-congregate and congregate shelter options, just because, depending on the sheer volume of people that we need to support throughout the state.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple other questions that came in. I'm going to save those for the open discussion. However, there was a quick, easy question that came into our Q&A. Jessica, you mentioned you're available to provide presentations. Just a quick question on how small of a group can you present to? Is there a size you'd
I
like
have
to?
no minimum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have no minimum. I'm happy to talk to any size group, and I can bring in your local contacts as well to continue the conversation. But we definitely want to have as many conversations as possible so that we can share information about what tools and resources we've developed, and then help problem solve with you about how we're going to do this in the safest way possible, both for our volunteers and the clients that we're serving.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll save the other two questions for the open discussion that came in. Folks, participants, if you do have further questions, please just make sure to preface your question with which presenter or which presentation the question is for, so that when we get into open discussion, we can route the question appropriately. I want to move on here to Billy Rhodes from FEMA Region 6, who's going to present on FEMA's pandemic operational guidance for the 2020 hurricane season. Billy, are you on the line and able to place yourself off mute? How about now, Billy? Try to speak and I hear you off mute. Yep.
Okay. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Billy Rhodes. I'm an operational planner out of FEMA Region 6 up in Denton. And I was asked by National Preparedness up at FEMA headquarters to just go over how you could leverage the pandemic operational guidance for the 2020 hurricane season. Next slide. Specifically, Appendix C, the response considerations in your planning efforts or your annex updates. I'm sure you've seen the guide, and everyone, we did send a message back to headquarters saying, is that 6 feet on the cover page? But we did want to highlight some of the things we did at FEMA Region 6 directly from the guide that I placed in our Texas hurricane plan for 2020. Next slide. So the contents in the operational guidance and its appendix were nationally developed. So before we begin, and before I provide specific examples, it may not all be applicable for your jurisdiction, for the state agencies, and our other partners on the phone. It was also issued and developed throughout April into May as the response division for FEMA Region 6. We provided dozens of comments back to multiple drafts. So this was an iterative development of a policy document. And so some things that may be in the guide may no longer represent the current situation as we know it today. And we anticipate that there'll be continuous changes to the situation throughout this hurricane season. Next slide. So for FEMA Region 6 and our planning for federal support for a Texas hurricane, we did want to provide some specific examples from the guide and how we took some of those questions or those considerations and actually implemented them for FEMA Region 6. So we've updated our incident information management processes and our reports and our GIS tools to incorporate what we learned during the coronavirus response and our support across the FEMA Region 6 states and tribal nations. And how are we going to combine the information requirements for COVID-19 response on top of the traditional incident information requirements for a hurricane response. So we're still working on these things, but we've worked on streamlining and reducing the complexity of reporting and reducing the number of reporting and leveraging technology more than we ever have in previous incidents. We also know that some of our federal partners have worked with some of their subsector council members. And for one example, U.S. Department of Energy has been working with the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council on any unmet needs to discuss any questions or concerns coming up for this hurricane season. And, so access to personal protective equipment and testing. They've worked with the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency and FEMA headquarters to work on shipments to some of the private sector partners in the interim as the supply chain improves and stabilizes. But that's just one example of what one of our partners on the federal side has done with their other subsector and subsector partners. We've also have in the guide on page 3, it talks about leveraging your existing coordination structures in an activation. So we have our Deputy Federal Coordinating Officer in the State Operations Center for COVID-19 response, who would also likely be the Federal Coordinating Officer for Texas hurricane response. So we're leveraging our existing personnel embedded in our coronavirus response in the SOC and the remote SOC. So that picture right there to the bottom right is our logistics planner for Texas for all hazards planning efforts, and her team who've been there since March, April, who are embedded with the state, whether it be at the SOC or the remote SOC. So we still have our teams there and in place and planning and preparing for this hurricane season while responding to COVID-19. Next slide. We also were able to leverage the activation for Tropical Storm Cristobal that made landfall in Louisiana. Historically, we in FEMA Region 6, we made decisions a lot earlier than I think we would have in any other situation. We activated to a level 2 operating level, and we mixed both virtual and actual physical employment into our Regional Response Coordination Center, mostly virtual. So we're going to have the same physical distancing requirements or protection measures in place, and leveraging who needs to be physically there, who's mission essential, and also leverage our technology for the response. And we may have pushed things, we maybe went bigger and faster than we normally would have, but as we've seen in previous presentations, the timelines for decisions have shifted to the left, and we are shifting along with our state partners and always in constant coordination in our activations, in our operations, so we're all in lockstep together. Next slide. One thing that has come out since the issuance of the pandemic guidance document that came out in early May is the Mass Care Emergency Assistance Pandemic Planning Considerations document that came out a couple of weeks ago. And the focus of that document is responding to pandemic environment concurrently with a natural man-made or technological disaster. So I just wanted to push that out there along with the Red Cross guidance and other guidance documents coming out. There is a Mass Care Emergency Assistance Pandemic Planning document out there that is also available for reference. And because this was a exercise focusing on mass care and emergency assistance, I wanted to put that out there. But always, this year, we just assume that the situation will continue to change. There'll be additional guidance documents coming out, but we'll continue to work with our regional partners across all our mission areas to build and sustain and improve our capabilities for responding to this hurricane season. And I just thank everyone for their time, and I'm open to any questions.
Great, thanks, Billy. Nothing that came in on the chat or Q&A, excuse me, during that presentation, but we'll give folks a chance to write those questions into the Q&A. Please address them for Billy Rhodes or FEMA Region 6, and we'll make sure to route those during the open discussion. So that's where we've reached for our portion of this workshop now, folks. We've concluded the official presentations that we wanted to get through. And now what we wanted to do is, now that we've gotten through those, spend about the next hour in 50 minutes or so, opening it up for discussion, circling back to some of the questions we weren't able to get to this morning or during some of the previous conversations. What we've done on the back end, like I mentioned, is we grabbed the questions that we weren't able to get to, circulated those to the presenters, and would like them to address them now and have it as an open discussion. If there's further questions that come in, you can continue to type those in the question and answer. The way we'll do this is in the same order of the presentations this morning, we'll address these questions. So I just want to circle back around to the folks over at the State Operations Center. And I know there were a few questions in there. If you've had a chance to look at them, Gisela, let me know. Otherwise, I can tee up some of the questions. You are off mute.
Yeah, good afternoon, thanks. I did get an opportunity to look through the questions. So how do you want to do this? Do you want me to just read the questions off and provide the response, or?
Yeah, I mean, I can go with it. I'll read the questions just for the benefit of everybody on the line, and then if you want to answer them. I'm sorry about that.
Certainly.
Cool. And if we've already covered it in some other conversation, we can just bypass it, but I want to make sure we get to them. In the event that the State Emergency Management Council is activated, with all members being required to staff in one person of the SOC locations, or will there be the ability to carry out our responsibilities remotely?
So the answer to that is yes. We actually are encouraging remote support. We've done that through COVID, our COVID response, because obviously wanting to keep social distancing, we don't want to bring, judging from Hurricane Harvey, I think we had in excess of 200 people here responding to Harvey. So yeah, so we'll identify those agencies that can support remotely and those that need to physically be located at either of the SOC locations.
Okay, great, thank you. Based on this scenario of a hurricane in a COVID environment, are all jurisdictions evacuating on their own?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Local jurisdictions make their own decision whether or not to call for evacuation. So is there any clarifying?
Not for that one, but if somebody who submitted that wants to clarify in the Q&As, we can circle back to it. So let's move to the next one here. Will PPE be redistributed if hurricane impact is focused in a specific region, for instance, the northern region?
The northern region of the state or northern region of like the upper Texas coast?
I believe
the state, the state's going to focus its support to whichever jurisdiction or region is being impacted or forecast to be impacted by the storm. So I don't see any change in how we have traditionally operated with state response activity.
Okay. How will the ARCC and the DDEOC interface to support response to local jurisdictions within the area of operations of the ARCC?
So normally the state will activate the ARCC to support staging operations in San Antonio, which for the last several years have been sort of the critical point of bringing in all state, federal resources in one location. The ARCC provides obviously the location, personnel support to help carry out the state's response missions. There shouldn't be any change in those relationships. The DDC is there to help support and coordinate with the SLC to the AAR or to the ARCC, and then the local jurisdictions would use their normal channels, their normal process, working up through the disaster district EOC to meet those needs. And if those needs can't be met, then those requests would be submitted to the State Operations Center. So there shouldn't be any change in our traditional process and channels of requesting support.
Okay, thank you. How will the ARCC, DDEOC, and the State Operations Center communicate and coordinate operations in support of the state resource staging areas, responder shelter operations, and commodity staging areas as needed based on state objectives?
So normally we have a liaison from the ARCC here at the State Operations Center, and then we actually create separate cells to handle pod operations, resource tracking, logistics operations. So we generally have pretty good communication through all those levels and all of those partner agencies that help support the state's response. And so that's been very effective in previous responses to hurricanes, and we'll continue that same best practice.
Okay. The next set of questions is particularly pertaining to logistics. So normally we start at least 120 hours out from storm to start preparing and moving assets. Are we now going to extend that time frame out to allow for gathering assets?
I'll answer that. This is Lisa again. I can answer that question. So generally at minus 120 hours, we're really still monitoring at that point, because if history tells us anything, those storms are pretty far away, and we don't generally have a very good forecast. But what we do is we start identifying all the different concepts and all the different components of our response that we need to start at least issuing advisories and alerting to get those things in place, so that when we are ready to activate those vendors, contracts, and responding agencies and teams are ready to go when we get ready to pull that trigger. But that early on is really more of a monitoring phase than it is actually pre-positioning things at that point in time.
Okay, just wanted to get, if the need for shelters exceeds the capacity statewide, would there be evacuations out of state?
I've been with TDM for 23 years. I've been here for Katrina, for Rita, for Dolly, for Ike, and for Harvey. Texas is tremendously blessed. We have never, I say never, you should never say never, but Texans stand up. Our Texas communities always are willing to stand up and support Texans in their time of need. I could probably say that the chances of us having to shelter out of state are probably not likely.
Okay. What personnel requirements would arise during a hurricane response in order to maintain COVID-19 operations?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yep. It's what personnel requirements would arise during a hurricane response in order to maintain COVID-19 operations?
So let me just make sure I understand the question. So if we have resources responding to COVID, and we needed those same resources to respond to the hurricane response, where would those assets come from? Is that?
Yeah, I think there's the balance of personnel requirements during both the hurricane and COVID operations?
Okay, so if we don't have them available within our existing state resources, we have this tremendous capability and program called EMAC, and that allows us to go out nationally to other member states and identify resources that the state of Texas would need, and we would bring those in under that mutual aid compact. And I want to clarify on the out-of-state sheltering question. So during Harvey, we did have some out-of-state sheltering during the very early days of Harvey due to the flooding, where the state of Louisiana actually did stand up shelters to take in Texas residents who resided close to the Louisiana border. They did that through the, we have a Region 6 emergency support plan, response plan, where the states agreed to provide certain resources in the event of a large catastrophic event. And so the state of Louisiana, we turned on that response plan, and the state of Louisiana graciously opened shelters to support those Texans that evacuated into Louisiana.
Great, thank you. Didn't see any other chat questions come in or questions from this morning that have gone unanswered. But again, if any of the participants out there have a thought and want to type a question in the Q&A, we can certainly come back to it. But I am going to move to DSHS. So thank you, Gisela. Because there were a fair amount of questions for DSHS, especially pertaining to evacuation and sheltering. So on the line, just want to check and make sure that Chris and Jeff, you all are able to unmute and speak.
Hi, this is Chris. I'm here.
Okay, great.
I believe Jeff's in the meeting right now.
Okay. Well, Chris, we'll tee him up for you, and if you need to defer to Jeff, or we can always come back if you rejoin in a little while. Chris, do you want to take a look at the questions that were sent over and pick and choose the ones to answer, or would you like me to just run through them all?
If you could just run through them all, and then we'll try answering them.
Sure. Okay. So a lot of social distancing type questions to begin with. With the need and speed necessary to evacuate, will we forgo current CDC guidelines, and how should essentially most social distancing be observed in true emergency evacuation situations?
Yeah. So I think immediate life-saving support is our #1 priority. I think that's the biggest threat, especially for any of the, when I think about that, the EMTS resources that are evacuating the folks from hurricane areas. So, that's definitely the precedent. And so that should be priority #1, and then followed by trying to prevent, COVID from spreading. And so, I know EMTS has had already experienced transporting folks with COVID, and they've made adjustments to their procedures, and they'll definitely maintain their PPE types of protocols.
Okay. Have you considered the extra time it may take to evacuate given the number of social distancing for increased mass transit modes?
I would think that's actually a question for the local governments. Have they considered in their planning factors that in order for the state to be able to support their evacuations, that those evacuation decisions may need to be made a little bit sooner, so that we can provide this appropriate amount of resources, evacuation resources, to affect a safe and, timely evacuation.
Okay. Thanks, Gisela. What would happen to buses of evacuees that had not been socially distanced once they arrive at their shelter site?
I think as mentioned, as even Jessica mentioned during her presentation, I think the first step for Gen Pop shelters is the screening part. Okay, that's definitely the first part. So no matter whether they're able to cohort into different buses or if they're mixed or whatever, I think that first part of the screening is going to be the important part for them to do once they get to the shelter.
This is Jessica. With Red Cross, I can also add that, there's going to be people that will come and drive up, driving up in their own cars who may not be socially distancing. And so there's going to be a variety of different people. So our screening process when they arrive at a general population shelter will be to identify what possible, respiratory symptoms they may be having. They'll be moved into an isolation care area if they are presenting with any symptoms. But we know that it may be COVID and it could be a series of other medical issues that just have similar symptoms. So that's why we'll parcel them out from the general population and have them in that isolation area until a better determination can be made by a medical professional. Do they need to be accelerated to a higher level of care, or can they just stay in that isolation area and be isolated from the general public?
Thank you, Jessica. What is the plan to track the patients in medical shelters?
Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, BCFS, we contracted them to do the medical shelters and turnkey operations. So they, once they arrive there, they will be tracking the medical patients, and they'll track them all the way up until they're released, and do the case management on the back end of things to make sure that they get, to the locations that they were previously.
Okay. And related to shelters, will shelter workers be tested for COVID-19?
Yeah, so as right now, we're not planning on putting that in any of the guidance currently.
Okay. Okay, now a couple of questions on deployment and other stuff at shelters. Are shelters pre-identified in TDEM plans? Are they under contracts or MOUs?
Mario Chapa, our State Mass Care Coordinator, are you on the call?
You can see, say Mario. Probably don't have the ability to speak, but let me see if I can track. Mario Chapa, yes, I can allow to speak. Mario, I've just elevated you to panelist, so if you activate your phone, you should be able to have the ability to speak. While Mario's doing that, we can move on to another question here. Will all medical shelter PTs be sent to San Antonio, or will you have medical shelters in other communities this year?
So yeah, all state evacuated patients will go to San Antonio, and that's where we'll have our primary medical shelter. In the past several years, even just last year, we have met with a couple local jurisdictions on how we can support any medical shelters that they need to stand up as part of Gen Pop shelters. So that doesn't mean that we plan on sending any state evacuated patient to those different locations, and I'm talking specifically about Tyler and Laredo. We won't send them any, but we know that in the past that as folks evacuate, they go to these locations, and they may be good, healthy when they evacuate, but once they get there to those locations, they may end up needing medical care, a small population. And so we've worked with these jurisdictions on how we can help support them, you know, as they have, if they have to build medical shelters at their locations.
Okay, I think Mario's not able to hop on the audio. Do we foresee any problems with hotels accepting evacuees due to COVID-19?
I don't believe so, but most of those hotels will be contracted with, and so obviously they will know that if we're going to be using them as non-congregate sheltering options, that they could potentially have asymptomatic COVID evacuees.
Hey, this is Jess with Red Cross. Another consideration for utilizing hotels is also many of the hotels have either laid off their staff or they're on kind of like a skeleton crew for cleaning services and their maid services, or just smaller shifts of people that work at the hotel. And so that will be something that will impact shelter operations. We've seen that happen across the country, even recently in the East Texas tornado in Polk County, where we had clients that were staying in hotels, and it took the hotels, in some cases, time to scale up to get those resources back, and they were limited with the number of times that they could clean the rooms. So just for planning considerations, I would add that.
Great, thank you, Jessica. I think one last question here. Will state and local employees deployed to other jurisdictions need to bring their own PPE, or will they be issued PPE as needed by the jurisdiction they're working in?
This is Gisela. Ideally, if the state is deploying state resources, our goal is not to be a burden on the jurisdiction that they're going to support. So the state will try to provide the necessary PPE for them so that when they arrive in those jurisdictions, they're fully prepared to support their mission.
Hello, Doug. This is Mario Chapa, Unit Chief from Mass Care. Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, sure can now. Thank you.
Okay. So can you repeat the question you had asked earlier as regards to contracting?
Yes, let me go back and find it. Gisela, which question was it that we had for Mario? I'm sorry, I've lost the spot in the...
Sure, let me see if I can find it here. I printed these out. Sorry, everyone. There's several questions here.
Hey, Gisela, it's Jess. I found the question. It says, are shelters pre-identified in the TDEM plans? Are they under contracts or MOUs?
Okay, a little bit how the state of Texas does sheltering within the state is a lot of what we do is working with partnerships with our local jurisdictions. The state has what is called shelter hubs, in which the state will partner with the jurisdiction to receive evacuees from the coast and be sheltered in their area. These shelter hubs have plans of their own on how they do sheltering normally, and they will enact those plans and what they do. So they have their pre-identified facilities and or areas that they would usually use. The state works in coordination to help with anything they need as they shelter the evacuees, including with personnel, and of course this year we're looking at PPE. But the state doesn't have that list of saying, okay, this is the facility we're going to use in this city. That is up to those local sheltering jurisdictions to have that in their plans, which most of them already do as they plan for everyday disasters as well. So that's the answer to that question. We are working this year, though, in identifying alternate type of facilities. If we're looking at hotels, we're working closely with the Red Cross on what sheltering means this year. And with new guidance that has come out from FEMA as of last week, we are working for new plans and partnerships with the shelter hubs. Unfortunately, I can't go into more detail as we're still developing that, but we'll be working with the shelter hubs here within the next coming weeks to help identify alternate sites for them.
Thank you, Mario. I had a question come in on the Q&A. I think this pertains to our current topic in terms of evacuation. Aren't there new state regulations for nursing homes to manage their own patient evacuation plans, including transportation? The idea is not to rely on EMS resources to do the evacuation at the last minute, correct?
Hey, this is Chris from DSHS. I think that's the HHSC question. Are we able to have any of them join the call to brief out on that? Maybe Carrie King, if she's on the list.
Let me check
Or
that.
Sarah. Carrie may be out, but Brent Whitaker or Sarah
Edel?
Odell.
Edel.
See if I can find Sarah to answer for us. Okay, I've got Sarah. If you're on the line, I've just elevated you to panelist. You'll have to activate your audio in the bottom left of the screen by clicking on the phone and selecting to connect to your computer or have it call you. We'll give Sarah a minute there if she's able.
Hi, this is Sarah, HHSC. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I think I heard the question as far as evacuating nursing facilities, and I know that our long-term care regulatory staff have met repeatedly with our long-term care facilities that we regulate as far as their expectations for emergency planning, most importantly now as we've entered the hurricane season. And they do address evacuations, and that is part of the planning process. That should be something that they've documented in their plans. So yes, we do take every effort to make sure that all of our long-term care facilities are setting up the transportation efforts in advance and not leaving that as a last-minute option to have state resources provided.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for hopping on quickly there. Well, if there's more questions that come in, we'll circulate those. I know for Holly and the animal issues we discussed earlier, she was able to address several questions. If there are further questions regarding that, please let us know, and we'll elevate them to the chat or elevate them to the discussion. I didn't have any questions come in for Texas Military Department either. If any questions come in, we can elevate them for the chat. I did have a few come in for American Red Cross that I wanted to bring up. So Give me 1 second to transfer over to. So Jessica, are there protocols in place to clean? I got that. Sorry, excuse me. If there's not a designated county health officer, who would take care of making the decision of quarantine of sheltered persons? This may also be a question appropriate for DSHS. Sorry.
Yes, so we would be working, if we did open any type of shelter, both congregate or non-congregate, we would be in working coordination with emergency management and the public health representative. Some of our cities have public health departments, some of our counties, and then others are covered by DSHS. And so it really depends on the jurisdiction as to who we would be coordinating with, but we would be regularly communicating what the symptoms. We have an aggregate morbidity form that reports the number of symptoms that people are having at a site. And then once it reaches that trigger, that's when our local health department would potentially come in and help make those decisions as to who would need to be quarantined. But as a safety precaution, we would ask those clients to isolate voluntarily. I'll pitch that over maybe to DSHS for more clarity.
Hey, this is Chris. Yeah, Jessica's pretty much right on target. You know, where there's no local medical authority or department in a jurisdiction, the DSHS Public Health Region will act as a local health department. And any ESFA type of issues can be coordinated.
Okay, and Jessica, there was a question earlier that we had asked for a little more clarification on during your presentation about testing considerations for shelters and hotels. Much of the conversation has been on established shelter operations, but any other options or ideas on testing for COVID once the shelter is already established?
So I'll answer maybe part of it. So the Red Cross, we currently don't have any procedures in place. And with our new sheltering guidance that requires any of our volunteers or the public to be tested when they're inside of the shelter, the testing sites are being run by the local jurisdictions or federal community-based testing sites. So our guidance is not requiring another entity to do something. Whenever we have opened shelters, both congregate and non-congregate, really in the last, I'd say 3 or 4 months, some local jurisdictions have made the offer available to our volunteers and clients that after the site closed or in the middle of the response, if they were interested in being testing, those services were available to our volunteers and clients. And they gave us an hour of operation and any information that they would need to bring when they arrived at that site, and to present that they were working on that disaster response and that they were eligible for testing because of that reason. So that I feel like is maybe more a local jurisdiction decision or even a federal community-based testing site, but we don't currently have procedures in place or any new guidelines that would require people to be tested once the shelter site is open.
Hey, this is Mike Miller from the SOC. Let me make a couple of comments, make sure we're clear as we talk about sheltering operations. Jessica's done a great job of talking about non-congregate and congregate sheltering from the Red Cross perspective. We at the state do not currently have a non-congregate shelter agreement with FEMA. We will have to get that upon request. We are prepared to make that request, but as of this moment in time, there is not a request that we can get approved through FEMA for non-congregate state-supported shelters. So Red Cross has a different scenario, and we appreciate what they do, but we certainly will be working, we have been working with FEMA now, so that we are prepared that if we need to make that request, we'll quickly go up through the regional administrator's office and hopefully get a quick response on that. Shelter testing will be done on a case-by-case basis as a need be. We'll look at where we are in the pandemic, and if that's the appropriate thing to do, we will provide those tests. Over.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions that I think could span our presenters, so I want to offer them up. And if somebody wants to grab it and then possibly build off another person's answer, that would be great here. But I don't know if we've, trying to think if we've addressed something like this yet today of how are we going to deal with individuals who are COVID positive without separating families?
So this is Jessica. I can speak on behalf of the Red Cross and Mass Care Services. So whenever a family presents at a Red Cross shelter, each family member will go through the screening process. And if that family has been in the same household, they've already been exposed to that person who is COVID positive. And so we would not opt to separate that family with that one person going into the isolation care area. So our goal would be to work with that family to create an area within the isolation care area that they would be able to be isolated. So we would present them with that option. Our goal would definitely not to be separating families because again they've probably all been exposed in the same household, and so there's definitely some level of risk.
Great, thanks. Is there a process in place to identify and screen self-deployed volunteers? That might be for you too, Jessica.
Yeah, I think from SOC's perspective, we prefer not to have self-deployed volunteers of any kind. Go ahead, Jessica.
So so none of our Red Cross volunteers will be self-deploying to any disasters. We've been really intentional with our messaging over the last several years that volunteers are activated and deployed. Now our volunteers are required to go through a screening process, both at their house before they make the decision to deploy, as well as if they arrive on site at a hotel, they'll be screened every single day whenever they are activated for their shift by our health services volunteers. So we actually, any outside or just spontaneous or event-based volunteers self-deploying would not be affiliated with us. And so we, unless they started volunteering with us, they would not be included in our screening process. That would be probably something for the any type of event-based volunteer intake center.
This could be for a couple different folks if you want to take it. What is the state plan in evacuating positive patients to other jurisdictions or sheltering hubs?
We're going to treat patients just like with any other situation. If we have to move them to the appropriate facility for care, that's what we'll do. But it's not our choice. It's going to be the local's choice as to who gets evacuated.
Okay. I've got a question here that asks, how would the state handle local jurisdictions closing their towns to evacuees along evacuation routes due to COVID-19? Would the state provide additional resources such as fuel, porta potties, etc.?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's something we can answer. We certainly provide fuel for our buses and porta potties and rest stations already, so that's something we can do. But I think that would be a political answer that I'm sure that we're not prepared to answer here.
Okay, one other question for TDEM. I understand there will be screening, but are there plans to test any shelter non-congregate evacuees during an event for COVID?
Yes, that'll all be situation dependent. As I mentioned earlier, we'll see where we are in the pandemic. We do have resources for testing, and if that's the appropriate place for them to be, that's where we'll put them.
Great. Well, I've made it through all the questions that came up on our Q&A and in the chat room. I wanted to come back to the group of panelists and ask if anybody had any other thoughts that came up during the previous conversations here to underscore a point or reiterate something that was said in any one of the previous discussions. And while you all are thinking of that, I want to just tee up Sabina to see if there's further discussions that you'd like to have on from the checklist of the FEMA pandemic operational guidance for the 2020 hurricane season.
Deb, yeah, this is Sabina. Yes, I had a couple of questions. One was that came to me via email, actually both did. Are there any shelters of last resort that are going to be set up along the coastline for those folks that do not want to evacuate, or that wait too long, that are worried about possibly contracting COVID in a shelter?
So, Sabine, this is Mike Miller. I'm not sure who you're directing that question to. We work with our local partners on both sheltering and evacuations, and we always encourage people to have shelters of last resort and other things so that if they can't get people out, which in this case certainly we play for real, they need to be prepared to do that, and we will support them with staff where appropriate and resources where appropriate. And I want to go back real quick, if I can. Scott Thomas, the FCO here, is in the State Operations Center too, and he's giving me an update on the non-congregate sheltering from the state's perspective. So I'm going to ask him to give a real quick brief on that. Scott?
Yeah, so for the rest of this calendar year through December 31st, FEMA's put a policy in place which basically does not require pre-approval for non-congregate sheltering from a Stafford Act declaration. So what that means is for the COVID response, a lot of jurisdictions have put in requests for a non-congregate sheltering that went up to the regional administrator for his approval so they could execute that. But FEMA's trying to give maximum flexibility to the states and the local jurisdictions so that they've got every tool in the toolbox, if you will, to shelter the public. So non-congregate sheltering does not require pre-approval. However, it's also not the only solution. So it's one of all your solutions for sheltering, and they don't want the non-congregate sheltering, PA-funded non-congregate sheltering to be the only solution you're looking at. And just keep in mind that when you do enter into a non-congregate sheltering situation, just be prepared to provide the data and the justification for why those decisions were made when those Category B projects are put together to reimburse the jurisdictions for that.
Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
back to you.
Thank you, Mike and Scott. I appreciate it. And the other question that I also received was, are there any, is the ARC going to be set up in San Antonio just the way it has always been? Are there going to be any changes in operating the ARC? And going along with that, any kind of pod operations with possibly limitation on staff? What are the plans that to support those, possibly through Texas Military Department or through other state agencies?
So we will make the request to the Alamo Area Regional Command Center. They have committed to support us, and we expect that will happen just as it has in the past. On pods, we will use Texas Military Department, we'll use Texas Forest Service, and all other state resources to support local pods as appropriate.
Thank you, Mike. Those are the only two that I had right now.
Okay, Sabine, I had one come in. This is for DSHS or Red Cross. Do we have an idea of the current capacity for coach buses in light of social distancing? Are we okay, slightly short, way short? And as an example, that the type of weather event we're talking about in this scenario, or an Ike level event.
So this is Gisela. So right now, if we practice social distancing on the standard motor coach buses that we normally get, we're looking at probably 15 packs per bus. So that kind of goes back to one of the points on my presentation, is that we need to identify very early on what those needs may be, so that we can acquire the necessary buses to make up, because we're going from 56 passenger buses to 15 per bus, so that's going to nearly triple the number of buses that we would need to possibly support a local jurisdiction's evacuation. I don't believe we'll have a shortage of buses, but we'll just need to identify early on what that number is going to be, so that the contractor can go out and acquire the number of buses that we require.
And Geesh, a good point, but I also want to reiterate that is going to take an extended period of time to load 15 people on a bus and get the buses that we'll need processed through. So again, your point about local decision making has to be the critical piece in this. Over.
Thank you both. I'm not seeing any other questions. There were a few coming in throughout this open discussion. I want to thank those of you who submitted them, and also provide a little opportunity here to enter any further questions. Sabine, I haven't seen any come in, so let me revisit some of the questions that came directly from the Pandemic Operational Guidance for Hurricane 2020 season, and just see if there's any of these. These were questions that are sort of posed within that document as questions to ask yourself as a jurisdiction in preparation for hurricane season, and see how, if there's preparation activities that could occur for it. So I'm just looking at the State Operations Center ones. I think we've answered a lot of these. We talked about modifying logistics contracts or MOUs. We considered how planning goals and objectives would be altered if resources are diverted for COVID-19. I think that one we've generally answered in one way or another throughout the presentations. Couple questions here for health considerations. I'm just reviewing them, that there was questions on purchase and stockpile of appropriate PPE, which we've talked about, need and speed necessary to evacuate, we covered. Let's just see if there's a question that came in. Are pods supporting shelters? Was a question that just came in. Are pods supporting the shelters?
This is Gisela, and the answer to that question is no. Pods are established to support impacted jurisdictions. There are other mechanisms to support the shelters.
Great, thank you. Sabine, I'm just reviewing some of these other questions that we pulled from that operational guidance document, and I think we've hit most of them in one way or another, if not directly.
Correct, and I just got another one as well. The question is, in a regular hurricane evacuation, MIST teams are deployed to the embarkation hubs. Will these MIST teams, will these MIST teams do any kind of COVID testing or COVID rapid testing?
So no, those teams will be deployed, but we're not going to be doing rapid testing before we put people on our bus. The idea of evacuating is get the people out of harm's way as quickly as we can, quickly identify with fever testing and things like that, but we can do that with anybody.
Thank you.
We had a couple questions come in on the Q&A. What wraparound services are eligible for people with disabilities in non-congregate sheltering?
This is Jessica with the Red Cross. So just a couple examples of some wraparound services would be, we'll have our health services professional on site that will be conducting daily screening to identify any functional or access needs that may need additional support. Then we would work with our logistics team internally to source any medical equipment or items that were needed for those to assist those clients so that they're able to stay within that hotel room and have their needs met. We do know that many hotels will have limited ADA accessibility. That's always been a challenge. And so we're gonna be working individually with that client to meet their needs in the best way. We'll also be asking every client to begin working with a recovery caseworker. That's where they'll be working on what those longer term plans are, but also will help identify any additional needs or barriers that they may have to moving on to the next stage of their recovery. With food options, those are going to vary per site. Some hotels have the ability to cook within the hotel room, others do not, and so we're going to be looking at different options like food boxes from the food bank that may be able to sustain a family of four, if there's a hot plate or something like that in the room. We may have hot meals delivered, we'll have food distribution and delivery. We've also been looking at some additional options for children's play kits. Normally, we would have an area set up in a shelter where the family would be able to have, positive play items for children and an area separate for that. That's not really going to be possible in a hotel setting, especially when we're promoting social distancing between the rooms. And so, we've actually been working with a couple different nonprofits to create children's play kits so that there's some entertaining activities that we can provide to those families. So I'm not sure if that answered the full scope of that, but please feel free to add more.
Thank you, Jessica. There was a couple other things that came in here. Scott mentioned non-congregate shelterings do not need pre-approval. Where can we find that in writing?
I have the policy here electronically. I've provided that to TDM, so it does exist. If you need a copy of it, I'm sure send an email to the SOC and they can send it to you.
Great. The question of how will contact tracing be addressed regarding evacuees that may become COVID positive within 3 days of evacuation?
Hey, this is Chris. Yeah, we'll definitely have to take a look at that and talk to our contact tracing team and see how we would address that.
Yeah, I have another question here as well. It says, have you confirmed that public shelters you normally rely on are available in the for the aftermath of an incident? have schools been removed from use?
Hey, Sabine, this is Mario. So for the most part, local jurisdictions are working out their plans. Really, that's going to be a local jurisdiction question, if whether or not they're going to be used in schools. And of course, the schools make their own determination whether or not they'll still be utilizing their facilities for sheltering. So it's really going to vary as you go from location to location on that. I know some schools are taking a look at it, but I don't know if there's been that much determination made at the moment.
This is Jessica with the Red Cross. So at this time, we still maintain our database of Red Cross shelters through the National Shelter System. We do have several schools, universities, different types of buildings that are available on those complexes. Those will remain on our list because we've already had those conversations with the jurisdiction about what services are going to be available at that site, as well as what we pay for on those sites. So those agreements are still in place, but just as Mario mentioned, every shelter, either faith-based, government building, or school district, all of those sites, it would be a one-on-one conversation when we made the decision to open, and so they could decline that offer, or we could choose to work together to open that site.
That's great. Thank you very much. I do have another one. With the increase in need for disinfecting and cleaning supplies, it was mentioned that PPE had been, or that the state had started to stockpile PPE. Would a local jurisdiction be able to get additional disinfecting and sanitation supplies for shelters and for also embarkation hubs?
So if it's a state-sponsored shelter, we'll do our best. We have a significant amount now, but again, we don't know what's going to happen between now and whenever this real hurricane happens. And we'll be working with the resources to reallocate those as appropriate.
Thank you, Mike.
Sabine, I had tracked one additional question from earlier in the day that may be something that needs to be taken offline, but offered for consideration. If we need utility representatives, as we did during Harvey, has a location for those folks been considered? The Public Utility Commission has an idea or two for these folks if needed.
Yeah, this is Gisela again. Yeah, I'll be glad to address that with Sean Hazard with the Public Utility Commission offline.
Great.
I do have one that came in, and that is, are there going to be any changes in transportation plans, including any changes to fueling stations or comfort stations?
This is Gisela. I am not aware of any changes as far as the locations go. I think one of the things that we are considering, that if we have local jurisdictions who may use school buses, obviously they can't go the same distance that the motor coaches are able to travel before refueling is needed. And so that's something that we are looking at, is looking at additional fuel support if we do in fact have jurisdictions who will try to use school buses.
Thank you, Gisela. Got another one. What support can hospitals expect if evacuation is necessary and the unit has several ventilator-dependent patients?
So I'm not too sure of the question. Are they asking on whether we'd be able to provide them any other ventilators if they're maxed out to their capability? I mean, if that's the question, then yeah, I mean, the hospital through local emergency management can submit a STAR for those type of assets for any type of that support. So
I think that we're looking at transportation support for them. Would they be flown out or would they be ambulance?
To move, like, so from a hospital in evacuation area to move them to another location? Is that the question then?
I believe that's what they're asking, yes.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, definitely like we've seen in the past, quite honestly, a lot of the hospitals, in evacuation areas, the Houston, areas, those type of areas, Galveston, et cetera, they absorb a lot of that themselves. They move their own patients to within their own system to other hospitals that are more inland. If there are requirements for the state to assist with that, then again that can come up through a STAR for assistance on evacuating any hospitals.
Thank you.
Indeed, I had a couple come in. Appreciate all the questions coming in. This is the purpose of the open discussion session, to continue to make sure that we answer or at least have an opportunity to hear the questions and give the presenters a chance to address them. Can we charge the changes that we need to make in our hurricane shelter plans and capabilities due to COVID challenges to the current COVID emergency protective measures declaration?
This is Gisela. I'm not sure I understand the question.
I read it as if there are accommodations in plans or capabilities that a jurisdiction needs to make due to COVID challenges, are those expenses reimbursable through the COVID emergency protective measures declaration?
So so I guess the question is saying if they have a contractor or a consultant that's writing their plans and they have to bring that person back in to update those plans, if the costs incurred to have that done are eligible costs, I'm not able to answer that question. We'll go ahead and take that question and present that to our recovery section for them to take a look at that and address that.
Okay, thank you. And Scott Swearingen, if you want to add more examples of the types of costs, we can provide that back to Gisela and the team for after the workshop. Is TDOT going to monitor evacuation traffic flow? Will jurisdictions have access, or how can jurisdictions have access to that information?
So TxDOT has a number of cameras that are publicly available within the larger cities, Houston, Corpus Christi, even up through San Antonio on a number of the major evacuation corridors. Other than that, unless we have drones that are going up, if we use Civil Air Patrol to monitor evacuation traffic on the major interstates, those are all resources we have. I'm just not sure how we make that available. It's not real-time available, but available. I'm sure we can make it available at some point. I just don't know whether or not it would be real-time. So we'll have to take that question under, we'll take that question and we'll take a look at that and see if we can provide a better response.
Okay. And earlier we were talking about capacity for coach buses and things like that. Are there any innovative partnerships with private sector providers like Enterprise or ride sharing companies in regards to evacuation. Might be something we just add to the list of we can follow up on, or it's
we can follow up on
that.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any additional discussions, especially with ride sharing. If they're local ride share, then they probably should be evacuating as well. So it may be looking at trying to bring ride share in from other areas, not impacted or forecast to be impacted. But obviously, you know, all options are on the table. We just, you know, need to work through those. But I'm not sure. Ride sharing may just add additional congestion to roadways that, you know, that may not be necessary or may, you know, inhibit, you know, the local evacuation. So, but we'll take that question on and take a look at that.
Great, thank you. One final one that came in, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think there might be a different detail in this one. And I'll ask Stephen Gage to type into the chat if I need some further clarification on it. But how would the state handle local jurisdictions closing their towns to evacuees along evacuation routes due to COVID-19?
I think Deputy Chief Miller addressed that earlier. That's not a question that we're obviously prepared to answer here and now. That's probably a question that has some obvious political considerations to it. So, but we'll go ahead and send the question to us, but I don't really think we have an appropriate answer for it at this time.
Thank you.
I don't think a town has the authority to lock itself down and not let.
Question here for the SOC on give access to monitor cell phone movement data from Google or similar data providers.
I definitely don't understand that question, but I can definitely say we don't use cell data in the SOC to monitor the movement of people.
Okay. I think that's the answer.
I have another one here too. Will NDMS be utilized for evacuation? What about air evacuation with commercial air and medical evacuation?
I mean, we can never say never. I mean, that is definitely an option if we need it. I can tell you we have lots of capability currently for evacuations through EMTF, and then as we did during Hurricane Harvey through the federal ambulance contract. So in the past, it can definitely change on circumstances. But in the past, we haven't had to use fully NDMS capabilities, and so, but it's always a possibility, and it's always there if we need it.
This is Chief. I just want to add one thing to that. The activation of MDMS requires local jurisdictions to make evacuation decisions very, very early on. It's a very large, complex response capability, and so it's not something that can be turned on rather quickly. And one of the reasons why we have not used it to its full capability in Texas is because it requires local officials to make those evacuation decisions very early on. And many of them, you know, aren't ready to start, you know, calling for evacuation at 48 hours prior and more prior to landfall. So So that's kind of a difficult decision for them to make. So it really solely relies on the local official to make that early call so that the federal government can get those resources spun up to be able to assist the state.
Thank you. That's all I got at this moment.
Okay, Sabine, I've got one more that just came in. Do all counties in Texas have a volunteer reception center VRC plan? Volunteer Houston are the designated coordinator of the Harris County VRC if when it is activated by the county judge. I'd like to, Brooke Parkinson, like to collaborate with surrounding counties in our operations area. So just main question there about all counties in Texas have volunteer reception center plans.
Chapa again. A lot of the jurisdictions will plan for some sort of volunteers, but not all of them have VRCs. VRCs are encouraged, but some places have them, some places don't.
Great, thanks. Further point on the whole Google data question, Gisela, and I think that the point and something that we'll add to that for post-workshop is similar to how it's used to determine compliance to stay-home orders. Some of that data can be used to determine the extent of evacuation from coastal areas. So potential opportunity there to utilize the data to monitor evacuations. And just an idea, I believe. And so I don't see any further questions coming in at the moment. We had a few trickling in throughout.
I don't see any at this moment either.
Okay. I'll give a couple heartbeats here, Sabine, to see if anybody else was typing in a question. For all the attendees' awareness, we have captured all the questions, all the chat, all the answers from the presenters in during the discussion today. So we'll comb through that to make sure there wasn't something that we had missed from earlier. And if there is, we'll be sure to pass it along to Sabine and her team.
Absolutely, and vice versa. We will send anything to you all. If we get questions after the workshop via email, we will definitely forward that and get that answered from the appropriate person, subject matter expert. We really appreciate you hanging in with us.
Yes. Well, I think we're close to wrapping up, Sabine. I don't want to spoil anybody's opportunity to submit another question, but I know we have some closing remarks prepared, and I'll turn it back over to you, Sabine, just to lead us into that one.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate that. First of all, want to make sure that everybody is aware that we had a tremendous amount of participation, so we're eventually going to get the full amount of the full number, and we'll let you know how much it was. Also, if you registered, which of course you're on, so you got a lot of information, but everybody that registered will also get our summary report. Very important, again, if you have any questions, please send them to me or to our tdim.exercises@tdim.texas.gov email address. And we will definitely circle back to you and try and get you any answers to the questions that you might have. Now I'm going to have to see if, considering we're a little bit early, but not too much, so we're doing pretty good actually. So, Gabby, are you online with us? We really want to ask Gabby and Sean to do a few closing remarks to our workshop.
Thank you, Sabina. I am. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Yes, Gabby. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all. This is Gabby Stromoli, Division Chief Preparedness with the Texas Division of Emergency Management. And I want to give you all a big heartfelt thank you for being on the call, for your questions. Thank you to the panelists for your information. It's really appreciated. And thank you to the NET as well for facilitating the discussion. I want to ensure that you all know that we are going to take steps to address all your concerns and questions if they were captured during this exercise or anything you have after the fact. Please know that we will take each and every one of your remarks and we will get back to you. I just want to say thank you again. You all are why Texas is so strong at what we do, emergency management, disaster response. And I know everyone's working double, triple time with COVID and everything else that's going on. And I want to say thank you and for helping keep us prepared. That's all I have, Sabina. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. I really appreciate it. And we really appreciate your support as well. It goes both ways. Sean, this all kind of started with you as a Region 2 exercise, so kind of figured we let you take the chance and share some last words with us too. I hope Sean didn't disappear on us. Calling Sean?
No, I'm trying to unmute. Of course, it's for some reason it escapes my capability. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, yes, awesome.
Could a second ago.
Yeah, I heard
Sean,
it too.
you appear unmuted on my admin panel.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Sorry about that. That's you would think the mute button wouldn't be this difficult. But no, I just want to thank Gabby Stromoli, Sabine Gum, Jana James, Roy Halpin, and Vera Hughes with our Team Preparedness Office. And I'm sure I'm missing somebody else, but who really helped design this workshop and transformed what was originally scheduled to be a regional hurricane exercise back in January when COVID was not first and foremost on all of our minds. Originally, that was going to be a local regional exercise here with the Southeast Texas region, Cheatham Region 2, Hurricane Thor. But then when COVID occurred, we had to quickly alter our pace, our direction, and see how can we incorporate a virtual workshop, a virtual exercise, and really open it to the entire state, since this was something that we're all seeing right now with the current pandemic. I'd also like to thank our various presenters and our FEMA partners for the National Exercise Division. Without your support, this workshop just would not have been able to happen. But most importantly, I want to thank the over 600 emergency management stakeholders who were on the call today. I believe this might have been our first statewide virtual hurricane workshop. I'm sure Sabine will probably correct me if I'm wrong on that. And I know at one time we did have about 600 people on the call. And that definitely does not show the countless other people that were probably in your room also listening on. So I'm sure those numbers are a lot more. But to be on a 4-hour-long virtual workshop about hurricane response in a pandemic environment while currently actually working a pandemic response speaks volumes to your dedication to your constituents, your professionalism, and just your love for Texas and Texans. I truly appreciate that. I hope everyone gained some insight as to how the state and our local partners will respond to a hurricane in a pandemic environment. And I also hope you found this beneficial and join us next time when we have future virtual workshops where we talk about the recovery side of a hurricane response and pandemic response, since that's one aspect we sometimes unfortunately gloss over, but that recovery is very important. So with that, thank you again, and I yield the floor back to Sabine.
Thank you, Sean. Very, very much appreciated. And yes, you were absolutely correct. This is the largest virtual exercise that we have done in the state of Texas. And if I'm totally, don't quote me on this, but I believe we had 861 participants altogether. So, which is a tremendous amount. And we could have not done that with our presenters that did a phenomenal job, especially and at the forefront, I really have to say our dishes partners. They've been working 16-hour days since, I don't know, end of January, I think, maybe February. So you guys have been phenomenal in putting this together, helping us put this together. So a huge thank you to you all and to our support from the National Exercise Division, which really kind of came into, like Sean said, for regional exercise and rolled up the sleeves and helped us put this into the virtual world. And we're really hoping that everybody has gained some knowledge. We're hoping that you can incorporate a lot of the things that you've learned today or heard today into your future planning, because that is really the important part. And that's what we are working for our citizens in the state of Texas. So with that, is there any other questions, anything that is out there that needs to be asked? This is the last chance. Otherwise, we're gonna pretty much go home.
Yep, haven't seen any come in, Sabine. Just a lot of thank yous.
Oh, that is fantastic. And we thank everybody for participating in this. Very good. With that, goodbye, everybody, and we'll see if we can do the recovery side in our next one. Bye-bye.